Hello, and welcome back to this series on the topic of the ultimate truth. My apologies for the slight delay since the previous video, but we're back on track and there's a lot more coming. In this video, we're going to discuss the Maya doctrine as found in orthodox Advaita Vedanta. We're going to be analysing this doctrine critically because there is a tension between it and the idea of a positive ultimate reality beyond our conception. I shall make the case that this tension is problematic insofar as it can be misinterpreted as implying a kind of dualism, though I don't think it is necessarily a problem for the Vedanta philosophy in general. In the subsequent video, we'll examine an opposing problem with the emptiness doctrine of Buddhism, so you should not take this video as an argument against Vedanta. Before we begin, if you find this content valuable and would like to enable me to continue with this work, please do consider supporting me through Patreon or YouTube. Any support would be tremendously helpful and sincerely appreciated. Thank you, and enjoy the video. So, as most of you all know, Vedanta is a school of Hindu philosophy that is based on the Upanishads, which are the latest part of the Vedas, which are the oldest scriptures of Hinduism. The Upanishads describe Brahman as the ultimate reality, and Atman as the true self. Human perception is clouded by Maya, which creates the illusion of separateness and leads to samsara, the endless cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. Moksha, or liberation, is attained by overcoming ignorance and realizing the true nature of the self as Brahman. In later Hindu philosophy, there emerged various interpretations of the nature of this realization, and whether Atman is literally identical to Brahman, or an aspect of Brahman, or an emanation of Brahman, and so on. Generally, the more devotional schools recognize some kind of distinction between the two as the basis for religious practices, while the more knowledge-focused schools do not recognize such a distinction. Advaita Vedanta is generally considered to be the most influential sub-school of Vedanta, especially in the West, and is chiefly associated with the sage philosopher Adi Shankara of the 8th century. And Shankara's position is, quite simply, that the only thing that really exists is Brahman, absolute non-dual consciousness, and that everything else is an illusion. Our perception of an individual self is an illusion, and the world of appearances outside of us is an illusion. He is, therefore, an absolute monist, because there literally is just one immutable thing which exists. But of course, nothing in our experience can be this one thing, because everything we experience is changing. Shankara thus explains that our perception is untrustworthy, and that what we think we are experiencing, we are not actually experiencing, and hence the world is an illusion. But what do we mean by illusion? Because if the illusion was something that actually existed in some misleading way, then there must be some kind of a distinction between the unchanging transcendent Brahman and the changing appearing world, which contaminates the notion of non-duality. Indeed, this would be similar to the dualistic Sankhya philosophy, where Purusha and Prakriti express Brahman and Maya respectively. On the other hand, if the illusion was something that did not exist at all, then there would be nothing underlying the illusion, and there would be no efficient cause for our perception of the world of change. That is, since we do perceive a world, there seemingly must be something real somewhere that is responsible for this perception. So there is an issue with calling the illusion of the world real, and there is an issue with calling it unreal. But let me backtrack a little bit. There's a lot of confusion about the Advaita doctrine of Maya that needs to be clarified. Hindu philosophy, for the most part, subscribes to a theory of creation called Parinamavada, which asserts that the world is a real transformation of Brahman. Brahman actually transforms into the world. The Advaita Vedanta school, however, endorses a theory known as Vivarta Vada, which asserts that the world is an illusory transformation of Brahman. Brahman appears to change, but in fact does not. Now, the doctrine of Vivarta Vada was formalized within the Advaita tradition several centuries after Shankara, and so some scholars have been keen to emphasize that this was not an original doctrine of Shankara. Shankara, in fact, put forward a theory of avyakta nama rupa, or unevolved name and form, which claims that the world evolves from a state of potential manifestation, that is, potential conceptual and sensory phenomena, or the potential for the projection of Maya. However, if phenomenal potential is the source of the world, while also being separate from Brahman, then this strongly resembles the dualistic Sankhya philosophy, which posits two eternal principles, the efficient cause Purusha, analogous to Brahman, and the material cause Prakriti, analogous to this unevolved name and form. In fact, Mula Prakriti is described in Sankhya using the same term, avyakta, meaning unevolved or unmanifest. Prakriti only becomes manifest when disturbed or unbalanced. So Shankara obviously denies that potential is a real independent principle, since he rejects the Sankhya dualism, but he also denies that potential, Prakriti, is an aspect of Brahman, since Brahman is changeless and passive. And this is a bit of a problem because, again, if the potential manifestation of form is not real, then it cannot actually be the efficient cause for the manifest world. The potential for the illusion of the world would itself be an illusion. Or in other words, there would be no cause of manifestation because there is not actually any manifestation. Yet this defeats the point of introducing the complication altogether. One is therefore left with a dilemma. Either treat this potential projection as an aspect of Brahman, as in other Vedantic schools, or as an independent ontological principle, as in Sankhya. However, the former option would mean that Brahman is not attributeless and unchanging, while the latter option would mean dualism. Shankara's successors in the Advaita tradition recognized this unresolved tension and responded by abandoning the theory of unevolved name and form. They replaced it with what became the standard Advaita doctrine, that the world is pure superimposition, a cognitive error, grounded only in ignorance with no ontological basis beyond misapprehension. This is the theory of Advaita Vedanta. While it may or may not have been Shankara's own view, it clearly emerged to resolve ambiguities within his formulation. As such, we proceed on the view that Advaita Vedanta is the definitive thesis of the doctrine which owes itself to Adi Shankara. For Shankara, Maya is like a screen that covers Brahman, making it appear as a changing world of subjects and objects. Maya is also the cause of the mind's tendency to categorize the world, such that all empirical knowledge is ultimately ignorance. In fact, all thought is a distortion of Brahman. But Maya is not utterly non-existent because it is a misperception of something that does exist. If we mistake a rope for a snake, that does not mean the rope is not real. And insofar as the rope is real, the snake that we see is not utterly unreal. Rather, the world is real in an empirical sense, as something that depends on reality, while ultimately it is not real. Though it is not absolutely unreal, because it is empirically real. And in order to explain the apparent contradiction between the unchanging nature of Brahman and the changing nature of the world, Shankara distinguishes between Brahman without attributes, Nirguna Brahman, and Brahman with attributes, Saguna Brahman. Saguna Brahman is the empirical, manifested aspect of Brahman, which is experienced through the veil of the illusory Maya, while Nirguna Brahman is the ultimate, unchanging, formless reality, which is never directly perceived as an object. Once the illusion created by ignorance is dispelled through knowledge, we realize that Nirguna Brahman alone is real, and that the world of Saguna Brahman is ultimately unreal. Yet, the world is relatively and empirically real because Saguna Brahman is the false appearance of something that is ultimately real. At the relative level, there is a duality between permanence and change, but at the ultimate level, there is only permanence. So, The world is neither absolutely real nor absolutely unreal. While we can call it real in a relative, empirical, or practical sense, this is merely a concession to ignorance that must be transcended, because the whole point of the doctrine is to rise above ignorance, and if we have done that, then there is no sense in which we can call the world real. It is ultimately unreal, an illusion. So, this idea of Saguna Brahman, or Brahman manifested as the world, is not ultimately a real thing. And if the manifestation of Brahman as the world is not ultimately real, then Brahman has not in fact manifested as the world. This is the doctrine of Advaita Vedanta. Brahman does not arise, does not change, and does not cease. It only appears that way due to ignorance. And as an analogy, we could think of our ignorance as a sort of fragmented pattern of arising, changing, and ceasing within the eternal and infinite structure of Brahman, which only appears temporal and spatial from within that limited, fragmented pattern. If Brahman was an infinite and random sequence of numbers, then within that sequence there would be strings that refer to themselves. Those strings could be thought of as Maya and ignorance. Self-reference appears within randomness, but ultimately it's all just random. And in a similar way, Maya appears within Brahman, but ultimately it's all just Brahman. So as far as we're concerned, the relative world of phenomena is not something that Brahman is actively expressing, it's merely a deluded perception superimposed onto it due to ignorance. Leela, the divine play, is not an actual expression of Brahman's nature, but merely a metaphor for how Brahman appears when viewed through the veil of illusion. And thus, for Shankara, the world is not a glorious emanation of the ultimate principle, but an illusion to be transcended through knowledge. Of course, we should not simply do away with the world. It has value and reality to the extent that through it we can reach liberation, but once we have reached liberation, then the world becomes little more than a mirage. And so, this is the problem referred to in the title of this video. It's not necessarily a theoretical or doctrinal problem, but a practical problem. And in order to understand what I mean by this, we need to consider the difference between Mahayana Buddhism and Advaita Vedanta. And that is because there is a tension between the attributeless noumenon and phenomenality, between Nirguna Brahman and Maya, which is not present between the ultimate and relative truths of Madhyamaka, emptiness and dependent origination. In both Advaita and Madhyamaka, the world is neither absolutely real nor absolutely unreal. For Advaita, it is an illusion that has no independent existence apart from Brahman, while for Madhyamaka, it is empty of intrinsic existence, while being empirically real as dependently originated phenomena. So, neither believe that the world is entirely real. The difference, of course, is how each tradition characterizes the ultimate principle, and the relation between the empirical world and the ultimate principle affects how we perceive the value or importance or significance of the illusion, which is our world. And since both of these ultimate principles, the fullness and the emptiness, are concepts intended to direct us towards that which is entirely beyond conception, there should not ultimately be any discernible difference between these two relations. That is to say, if Nirguna Brahman, fullness, and Sunyata, emptiness, are equally beyond conception, then as far as our intellect can gather, they should relate to the empirical world in a similar way. This is clearly not the case, though, because the conceptualization and characterization surrounding these non-conceptual ultimate truths is obviously very different in either tradition. While we cannot conceptualize the ultimate truth, we can obviously conceptualize the fact that we can't conceptualize it, and insofar as we can have experiences of the ultimate truth, we can apply concepts to our experiences. For Advaita Vedanta, the world is an illusion overlaying an unchanging perfect reality. Empirical experiences are misperceptions of Brahman, like mistaking a rope for a snake. Liberation is realizing that nothing was ever separate from Brahman, which is oneself, leading to a sense of wholeness and peace. The empirical world is to be absorbed, so to speak, back into Brahman, and is seen as a false superimposition. Since Brahman is the ultimate reality, the world must be ultimately unreal. Advaita collapses the relative into the ultimate. For Madhyamaka, on the other hand, the world is a flux of interdependent phenomena which are empty of inherent existence. The world is not an illusion hiding some deeper reality, but is simply misunderstood due to conceptual imposition. Liberation is realizing that there was never anything to grasp in the first place, including a self or an underlying reality, leading to a sense of openness and peace. The empirical world is then seen as a dynamic play of conditions without any fixed essence. Since there is no transcendent ultimate reality apart from phenomena, ultimate reality is simply the emptiness of the immediate world. Madhyamaka collapses the ultimate into the relative, in the sense that emptiness is the mode of empirical existence rather than its foundation. So, for Advaita, our error is that we mistake appearances for real things, and to solve this error, we need to recognize the undivided reality beneath them. For Madhyamaka, our error is that we impute this idea of essence onto things, and to solve our error, we need to recognize their interdependent and empty nature. Both lead us beyond concepts, but Advaita leads to a collapse of oneself into the fullness of Brahman, while Madhyamaka leads to a radical letting go and dissolution of all conceptual clinging into emptiness. Now, keeping in mind that the ultimate reality is supposedly beyond any attribute whatsoever in both traditions, the potential issue with saying that there is something hidden, i.e. Brahman concealed by Maya, is that it could reinforce in the student's mind the idea that there really are two different levels to reality, the illusory appearance and an ultimate foundation. It's very easy to say that all change is unreal. It's harder to sincerely accept this when you're getting slapped in the face. If we say that the truth is something other than everything we know, then we are inevitably going to encourage dualistic thinking, where the empirical world is dismissed as merely an obstacle to be transcended, rather than as something to be contextualized and integrated. Because, good luck with getting rid of the world. The idea that there is something being hidden implies that liberation is a transition from ignorance into a higher truth, and this notion of a higher truth can be clung to, just as pure consciousness and the concept of Brahman can be clung to. Madhyamaka does not have this soteriological danger because it does not say that anything is hidden. Everything is already free as it is. There can therefore be no inclination to negate or transcend the world itself, only our conceptions of the world. And since there is no transcendent thing to seek or hold on to, there is no danger of subtle conceptual attachments. Emptiness is dependent origination, which is to say, the absence of intrinsic existence is the presence of extrinsic existence. Now, I want to be clear here that this is not a criticism of Advaita in favour of Madhyamaka, because we'll find in the next video that there is an opposing limitation going on in Madhyamaka, where it ends up not implying enough about the status of ultimate reality, or worse, implying too much in the opposite direction, so that the student is in danger of nihilism and of believing that the world is ultimately rooted in a genuine kind of nothingness. In defense of Advaita Vedanta, Maya was never claimed to be a real second thing apart from reality. It's merely a misperception of the single reality. From an ultimate perspective, nothing actually is hidden. The world is simply misunderstood as having some kind of changing nature separate from the permanence of Brahman. We can talk of reality as being hidden from a conventional perspective, but this is not intended to reinforce a search for something beyond experience. The confusing part of this arises from the claim that Brahman is both the fundamental ground of phenomena and devoid of all attributes. Consider, we do perceive attributes and phenomena, but Brahman has no attributes, so what we perceive is not Brahman. Indeed, what we perceive does not exist, because only Brahman exists, which we do not perceive. But it is undeniable that the world appears. We do perceive it. And indeed, in the Upanishads, Brahman is also said to be immanent in the world. All this is indeed Brahman, they declare. But this could easily be confusing if Brahman is definable only through the negation of all concepts. Neti. Everything is Brahman, yet nothing is Brahman. So, is Brahman distinct from the world, or is it just the world itself? The only way to make sense of this, I think, is to recognize that Brahman is not an ultimate substance underlying reality. If it were, it would have definable characteristics and would not be truly attributeless. But Brahman also cannot be entirely transcendent or cut off from the world, because that would either introduce a duality between Brahman and the world, or annihilate the world completely. So Brahman cannot be understood as beyond the world, nor can it be understood as within the world. All we can say is that Brahman is that in which all distinctions between subject and object, existence and non-existence, transcendence and immanence cease to have meaning. The doctrine is confusing because reality actually is confusing. Reality is beyond conceptual thought, yet we are trying to grasp it through concepts. And again, both Buddhism and Advaita Vedanta acknowledge that the ultimate truth is ultimately beyond conceptual description. Now, if we consider Yogacara, for instance, there we also find a description of an immediate, self-evident, luminous awareness that remains when all conceptual content falls away. It does not call this an inherently existent ultimate reality, but this thing is beyond concepts anyway, so when Advaita calls it the supreme and ultimate self, it's only speaking from a conventional standpoint. The difference in how the non-dual experiences and recognitions of different traditions are interpreted must be at least partly historical and cultural, Yogacara having developed from Buddhism, which does not like the concept of self-nature, and Advaita having developed from Vedism, which does. What this means, at least to me, is that Brahman is not just a purely positive fullness, but must also have a more negative interpretation as well. Its so-called fullness is the absence of conceptual limitations, which means it must be beyond both affirmation and negation. Brahman is not something to be realized, but simply what remains when all false distinctions dissolve, and in this way, I feel that Brahman may well bear a stronger resemblance to the Buddhist concept of emptiness than is often acknowledged. I think part of the reason for this difference in interpretation is that Buddhism is using our conventional understanding of truth to say that the ultimate reality is totally beyond this conventional understanding and processes of reasoning. It cannot be called true nor false. But Advaita Vedanta is saying that our conventional understanding of truth was never valid to begin with, and there is a more ultimate form of truth which can be ascribed to that which is beyond concepts. In other words, Madhyamaka is saying that the negation of the four alternative conventional truth values and the panjective is all and none of them at once, the viewless view. And Advaita Vedanta is saying that the negation of the four alternative conventional truth values is the real and only valid truth, the ultimate view. The predecessor of Shankara's Advaita, the 6th century Gaudapada, in fact employs Nagarjuna's Chatuskoti to show that the four-cornered negation is the structure of Maya, which sounds exactly like paraphilosophy's assertion that the dialectical matrix is the structure of the phenomenal world. And Gaudapada made good use of Buddhist ideas and Buddhist terminology in order to reach his own Vedantic conclusions. For this reason, several of Shankara's competitors, like Ramanuja, accused him and Gaudapada of being Buddhists in disguise, though I find this doubtful because if they were, then surely they'd be arguing for emptiness and not for Brahman. However, as we've already mentioned, there are similarities between the two concepts, because both are reached via the negation of all possible views, by the Chatuscotti, meaning that both should transcend the conceptual extremes of existence and non-existence. We have also discussed how both traditions hold the empirical world to be neither real nor unreal. For Madhyamaka, it is dependently originated, while for Advaita, it is an illusion. So, there are two ways in which the traditions are similar. Both posit an attributeless ultimate principle, Sunyata and Nirguna Brahman respectively, and both deny the independent reality of the phenomenal world, Pratitya Samutpada and Maya respectively, or interdependence and illusion. I think we should briefly discuss the relations between these concepts in a little more depth. Simply put, emptiness and interdependence are two aspects of one and the same truth, while Brahman and Maya represent knowledge and ignorance. The relativity of the world therefore comes out in two very different ways, and this is the most important difference between the traditions. Again, Madhyamaka does not posit a self-sufficient ultimate reality, and so the phenomenal world is the only reality. Even though the world is neither entirely real nor entirely unreal, it is still reality. And so what Madhyamaka is really saying is that the notion of truth always pertains to the phenomenal world. Emptiness is itself empty. The illusion is reality. Samsara is nirvana. But for Advaita Vedanta, we must look beyond the empirical world to realize the non-dual nature of Brahman. The truth is without the world for Advaita. The truth is within the world for Buddhism. Advaita subsumes the relative within the absolute. Buddhism, and particularly Madhyamaka, subsumes the absolute within the relative, because the absolute is the reality of the relative. The actual difference is really quite subtle, because both traditions would agree that the world is ultimately unreal. It's just that the reasons why are different. Advaita would be happy to say that at the ultimate level the world is unreal, but Madhyamaka would be apprehensive about this because they reject the notion of an ultimate level as something more real than the relative level. At the ultimate level, the category of real and unreal does not apply. Again, the world is not a veil covering ultimate reality, but simply lacks inherent existence. They would therefore rather just say, at the ultimate level, the world is empty. However, in the Buddha nature tradition, as well as East Asian and Tibetan Buddhism, the ultimate level is spoken of in a more affirmative manner, which bridges the difference a little more, but we'll discuss this in later videos. Anyway, Shankara is essentially making two critical claims. First, that everything empirical is an illusion, that is, in an ontological sense, and second, that ultimately reality has no attributes. The challenge with this is what remains after negating all attributes that can be affirmed as a positive reality. How can we make sense of the claims that Brahman is ultimately real? And what distinguishes this Brahman from a negative ultimate principle like Sunyata? If Nirguna Brahman was indeed more of a negative thing, like emptiness, then Maya would be simply our mistaken belief that attributes are ultimately real. Brahman and Maya could then be two different ways of understanding the one reality, which is neither absolutely real nor absolutely unreal. Brahman would be Maya, just as Nirvana is samsara. And this line of thinking is in no way new. Many of the Upanishads, so as the Samkhya school, characterize the universe as an interplay of Purusha and Prakriti. Purusha is the unchanging consciousness, Atman or Brahman, while Prakriti is the phenomenal world, Maya or Leela. In their attempts to present a more universalistic Hinduism, modern Vedantic scholars like Sarvapalli Radhakrishnan and Swami Vivekananda argued that we must understand both of the aspects of Brahman as real, Nirguna and Saguna, or Brahman without attributes and Brahman with attributes. Saguna Brahman is not just Brahman seen through Maya, but is the active, manifest aspect of Brahman. Maya is not something to be removed, but something to be properly understood. In regard to the status of the world, then, Neo-Vedanta is arguably more similar to Ramanuja's qualified non-dualism, or the school of difference and non-difference, or even Kashmir Shaivism, than to Shankara's Advaita. So it's worth considering the similarities and differences between Advaita Vedanta, Neo-Vedanta, and Madhyamaka Buddhism, if we take as a premise that the highest truth is ultimately and absolutely beyond concepts. So, if the ultimate principle, whether interpreted as emptiness or as Nirguna Brahman, is totally beyond any concept whatsoever, then we just cannot say anything about it that is ultimately valid. This holds true in all three traditions. We'll refer to it as the parajective for simplicity. However, in Advaita Vedanta, the parajective is ultimately passive. It does not express itself as the world, because the world is not real. In Neo-Vedanta and Madhyamaka, on the other hand, the world is an expression of the parajective. For Madhyamaka, emptiness is dependent origination, and for Neo-Vedanta, Nirguna Brahman is Saguna Brahman, and therefore is also Maya. The former is the ultimate expression, while the latter is the relative expression, but both are unified as one. While Madhyamaka does treat the world as not ultimately real, like Advaita, it is also not ultimately unreal. Furthermore, in Madhyamaka, it is also still the case that the parajective, emptiness, serves as the passive possibility for the relative existence of the world, while in Advaita, the appearance of the world is incidental and inexplicable in relation to the sole reality of Brahman. So, Madhyamaka and Neo-Vedanta are similar in the sense that the world is a meaningful expression of the ultimate principle. To summarize all three, in classical Advaita, only Nirguna Brahman is ultimately real. The phenomenal world is neither entirely real nor unreal at the conventional level, because it is empirically real, while being entirely unreal at the ultimate level. The conventional is therefore entirely subsumed and cancelled out in the ultimate. In Neo-Vedanta, the ultimate reality has both Nirguna and Saguna aspects. The phenomenal world is real as an expression of Brahman at the conventional level, and it is real as Brahman itself at the ultimate level. The conventional is therefore grounded in and expressive of the ultimate. And in Madhyamaka, the ultimate truth is the absence of true existence within phenomena. The phenomenal world is real as a dependently arisen appearance at the conventional level, and it is neither real, unreal, both, nor neither at the ultimate level, in the sense that it has no ultimate existence, but it does have conventional existence. The conventional is therefore the expression of the ultimate, and the ultimate is the true nature of the conventional. In other words, things relatively exist because they have no true existence, and the absence of true existence is the true nature of relative existence. Of course, Neo-Vedanta says that Brahman is an active cause of the world, but if we consider that in Yogacara, Vijnana consciousness is itself the positive expression of emptiness, it is possible for us to interpret emptiness as indirectly being active, and at a certain level, even intentional, through the mechanism of karma. In this way, Nirguna Brahman is to Sunyata as Saguna Brahman is to Vijnana, the difference between them being their respective ontological statuses. But if, instead of increasing the ontological status of Saguna Brahman and Maya, that is, making Maya real, which is the Neo-Vedanta idea, we were to decrease the ontological status of Nirguna Brahman, that is, make it more similar to Sunyata, while also accepting Shankara's claim that Saguna Brahman is not ultimately real, then, well, we'd have something that sounds very much like Mahayana Buddhism, and the difference between Advaita Vedanta and Neo-Vedanta will have largely disappeared. To explain that more simply, Neo-Vedanta recognizes the tension between the attributeless Nirguna Brahman and the ultimate unreality of Saguna Brahman and Maya. Its solution is to elevate the status of Saguna Brahman and Maya. But if instead we were to deny that Nirguna Brahman is an absolute, inherently existent reality and is rather beyond all qualification in the same way as Sunyata, then that would make Vedanta and Buddhism sound more similar. Before we end this video, I want to share the conclusion of Radhakrishnan's paper on the doctrine of Maya, because it surmises what we've been talking about quite nicely, but from a different perspective, the perspective of a Vedantin. I do not include this as any kind of argument in favour of the Neo-Vedantic conception of the conventional world. I include it to convey why a Vedantin might want to accept that conclusion in the first place. I, in fact, don't have too much of an issue with the alternative which Radhakrishnan seeks to warn us against. Radhakrishnan is mainly concerned that Nirguna Brahman sounds too much like a negative absolute in Shankara's model, and so rather than accepting that the only true form of Brahman is beyond all concepts and attributes, he would rather increase the ontological status of Saguna Brahman, whereby Maya is real as the power of Brahman, and whereby the illusory aspect of Maya refers not to the mere appearance of the world, but to the misperception of the world as ultimately real, which is to say, real in itself apart from Brahman. So he writes, "Let us conclude this discussion concerning the place of Maya in the Vedanta philosophy with a consideration of the positive or the negative nature of the Absolute. Is Brahman the fullness of being, or is it an empty abstraction? The Vedantins, including Shankara and his followers, admit that Brahman is all real and all perfect. But this all-reality of Brahman can be granted only if the world is real. If the world is Maya, then Brahman becomes a pure blank, a negative infinite. That is, again, because then Brahman would have no content or expression, being defined only by what it is not. It is, as Hegel would put it, a spurious infinite. It is a mere beyond which we do not know. It can never be the explanation of all that is, for there is nothing. The world is not. But according to the Vedantin, the Absolute is pure affirmative being, the presupposition from which all determinations of the finite proceed. Knowing it, we know everything. An acosmic interpretation, like the theory of Maya, that denies the reality of the finite world will make the Vedantic Absolute a pure nothing. But according to the earlier Vedanta, the Absolute is not merely the negation of the finite, but is its explanation. The Absolute includes the finite. It is the whole. It is the self-determining principle which manifests itself in all the determinations of the finite without losing its unity with itself. The Absolute involves the diversified universe as the universal involves the particular. We do not deny the reality of the particular. We say its reality is due to the reality of the general principle. Just as the general exists in the particular, so the Absolute exists in the finite. There is no finite without an infinite, and no infinite without finite. These are the necessary sides or moments of one and the same concrete reality. It is absurd to say that finite experience is illusory. If you think the world is illusory, then the Absolute becomes pure vacancy, and, in fact, neither more nor less than nothing. It is a matter of indifference whether you call it being or nothing, a conclusion with which no Vedantin will agree. And to be consistent, no Vedantin should agree with the theory that the world is illusory. The conclusion at which we arrive is that the doctrine of Maya is not an integral part of the Vedanta system of philosophy. So, Radhakrishnan is reasoning that, from the premise that Maya is like a veil over the ultimate principle, if the ultimate principle is a fullness, then Maya should be real insofar as it is substantiated by fullness, while if the ultimate principle is an emptiness, then Maya would be unreal insofar as it's substantiated by nothing. But I would say in addition to this that if Maya is not really a veil, but something closer to the Buddhist idea of dependent origination and the lack of independence, then the negative interpretation of Nirguna Brahman as something similar to Sunyata would not necessitate that everything is an unreal illusion. Nirguna Brahman could just be the open precondition for and ultimate nature of dependent phenomena, just as emptiness is the precondition for and ultimate nature of dependent phenomena. The world, while not absolutely real nor unreal, would then be the only thing we can definitively say is real in any ordinary sense. It would be the only strictly positive reality, and so not just an ontological illusion. Remember, the world is conventionally and relatively real for the Buddhists because a negative ultimate is an aspect of the relative, whereas for Vedanta, the world is relatively real because the relative is an aspect of a positive absolute. However, if Nirguna Brahman is negative, then Saguna Brahman is its positive aspect, just as in Yogacara, Vijnana, the mind stream fueled by karma, is the positive appearance of Sunyata. And East Asian and Tibetan Buddhists take this idea further, grounding the dynamic, individualistic idea of Vijnana consciousness in a more static, universalized idea of Buddha nature, equivalent with emptiness, closing the gap even more with the Vedantic concept of Brahman. And that's it for this video. Like I said at the beginning, we're next going to be considering a complementary problem in Buddhism, particularly in regard to the doctrine of no self. If you enjoyed this video, please consider supporting me, and I look forward to seeing you back for the next installment. Goodbye.